The day my family carried our boxes into the new house, Vanessa Crowley stood in the middle of my driveway with her arms folded like she owned the whole neighborhood. She looked at my mother, then at my sister, then at me, and she said we did not belong here. 10 minutes later, a patrol car rolled up because she had reported a suspicious family occupying a home illegally. I did not argue. I handed the officer my keys and waited while he checked the records. Then he turned to Vanessa and read the name on the deed out loud. It was mine. My name is Darius Holloway. I was 46 years old the summer I closed on that house, and I had spent almost 6 months negotiating for it. Not because it was the grandest place in Wellington Crest, because it wasn't. There were homes 3 streets over with stone columns and circular drives and fountains that ran all night for nobody. Mine was a solid brick colonial with a wide porch, a slate roof that needed attention in about 4 years, and a kitchen the previous owners had never bothered to update. What made it worth the wait was the land. The lot ran deeper than anything else in the subdivision, almost 2 full acres, with a stand of old oaks along the back line that were standing there long before anyone drew a single street on a map. The listing agent told me the parcel had been carved off an old estate before the development went up. I remember filing that detail away without thinking much of it. It seemed like the kind of thing that mattered to surveyors and nobody else. I would learn otherwise. I manage commercial construction projects for a living. Hospitals, schools, distribution centers, the occasional municipal building that takes 4 years and 11 change orders and ages you a decade. It is not glamorous work. It has taught me 2 things that shaped everything that happened that summer. The first is that paper beats opinion every single time. A man can stand on a job site and swear the beam was specified at a different depth, and he can swear it with his whole chest, and it will not matter because the stamped drawing is in the trailer and the stamped drawing does not care how loud he is. The second is that you should never be the person shouting when you are the person who is right. Shouting invites people to argue about your tone instead of your facts. I have watched men lose sound positions that way, so I learned to be quiet and to keep receipts. The move happened on a Saturday in June. Hot, flat, humid Carolina heat, the kind that sits on your shoulders like a wet coat. Most of the furniture had come the day before with a crew I hired. What was left was the personal freight, the things you don't hand to strangers. My mother's china, photo albums, box of my father's tools I have never once used and will never give away. My mother, Lorraine, was 69 that year and had insisted on coming, not to carry anything, though she tried twice, but to decide where things went. She had a way of standing in an empty room with her hands on her hips, taking the measure of it, and announcing that the sideboard went on the east wall and no other wall would do. She was right about that sort of thing more often than felt statistically reasonable. My sister Camille came too. She is 38, an accountant, and if I got our father's patience, she got his ability to spot a discrepancy at 40 paces. She had already made a list of everything the sellers had left behind and everything they had promised to leave and hadn't. Camille does not let things go. That morning she was in a good mood, teasing me about the size of the kitchen and asking who exactly I was planning to cook for. That was the picture at 11 in the morning, a rented truck at the curb. My mother in the doorway with a clipboard she had brought from home. My sister in the driveway cutting tape on boxes, me in a faded gray t-shirt with a sweat line down the middle of it, hauling a dresser drawer under one arm, looking like exactly what I was, which was a man moving into a house on a hot day. A white SUV came up the street slower than it needed to, then stopped at the foot of my driveway, not at the curb, angled across the entrance the way a car parks when the driver does not intend to be there long but does intend for you to notice. The woman who got out was in her early 50s in cream slacks and a pressed blouse that had not seen a single minute of that heat. Her hair was set. Her sunglasses came off in one practiced motion and went into her hand like a prop she knew how to use. She did not say good morning. She did not say welcome. Her eyes went first to the truck, then along the row of boxes on the lawn, then across my mother, my sister, and me, and I watched her do arithmetic behind her face and arrive at a total. "Where's the homeowner?" she said. "Standing in front of you," I said. She laughed. It was a small, light, generous laugh, the kind you give a child who has said something charming, and it told me more about the next 3 weeks of my life than any sentence she spoke afterward. Then she asked me the name of my moving company, and she asked it the way you'd ask a waiter for the soup of the day, already looking past me at the house. I put the drawer down on the grass. My mother had come out onto the porch. Camille had stopped cutting tape. I understood in that moment that I was not dealing with a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding corrects itself when you supply information. What was in front of me was a conclusion that had already been reached, and my job in her mind was simply to confirm it. "I'm not with a moving company," I said. "I bought the house. Closed Thursday." She smiled at me with a patience that was meant to be visible from the street, and she said that she was Vanessa Crowley, president of the Wellington Crest Homeowners Association, and that she needed the family off the property before she was obligated to call someone with authority. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to tell this story as though I had a plan. I did not have a plan. What I had was a set of instincts from 20 years of standing between people who were angry in paperwork that was accurate, and those instincts told me one thing very clearly: do not raise your voice and do not go inside. So I stayed where I was in the driveway of the house I owned in a sweat-through t-shirt, and I asked her a question instead. "What's the address you think I'm at?" She said it back to me correctly, house number and street, without hesitation. She said it a little impatiently, as though I were testing her on something beneath her. "That's right," I said. "So you've looked up who owns it." Vanessa said that she knew the people who owned homes in this community. She said it as a complete answer. She said it the way a person says a thing that has never once been challenged, and there it was, the whole architecture of the next several weeks in a single sentence. She had not checked anything. She had not opened a county record or a title page or an association roster. She had looked at me and at my mother and at my sister, and she had decided with her eyes what the paperwork must say. I told her again, calmly, that the transaction had closed on Thursday, that I had the recorded deed and the closing package in the house, and that she was welcome to look at any of it. She did not ask to see it. That is the detail I've gone back to more than any other. In every version of that morning I have replayed, she never once asked to see a document. A person who is worried about a stranger occupying a neighbor's home asks for proof. A person who is worried about who is moving into the neighborhood does not need proof, because proof is not what she is missing. Instead, she said, "And how long have you been renting?" Camille started forward. I have known my sister her whole life, and I knew what was coming, the full itemized statement, delivered at volume with dates. I said her name once, just her name. She stopped, and she looked at me like I had lost my mind, and I gave her the smallest shake of my head that would still count as one. Because here is what I knew. If Camille went off, then this became a story about an angry family shouting at a woman in a driveway, and the address on the deed would become a footnote, and I wanted to see how far Vanessa Crowley would go on her own, with nobody helping her, with nothing pushing her but her own certainty. She went further than I expected. She turned to my mother, who was standing on my porch in her good sneakers with a clipboard in her hand, and she asked, in a tone of pleasant curiosity, what the homeowner had hired her to do. I have replayed that too. My mother did not flinch. She has 40 more years of practice at this than I do, and she had already decided that the woman in the driveway was not going to be given the satisfaction of a reaction. She said, "I'm his mother," and she said it evenly, and then she turned and went to the door and held it open for Camille, who was carrying a box now with more force than the box required. Vanessa took out her phone. I thought, briefly, that she was going to look something up, and I remember feeling something close to relief, because a lookup would have ended it right there. She photographed the rental truck's plate. Then she walked 4 steps down the sidewalk and photographed Camille's car. Then she came back and told me that the association had strict provisions regarding non-resident occupants and unregistered vehicles, and that she would be documenting everything. "Go ahead and document it," I said. "I'd like you to." Something about that bothered her more than anything else I could have said. She wanted friction. Friction would have been useful to her. What she got instead was a man in a wet t-shirt agreeing to be photographed, and it left her standing in a driveway with nothing to push against. So she made the call. I was 8 feet away, and she did not lower her voice. She did not describe uncertainty. She did not say she was unsure who had moved in and wanted it checked. She told the dispatcher that unidentified individuals were occupying a home in Wellington Crest, that a truck was being unloaded into the property, and that she did not believe the people present had any right to be inside. She used the phrase illegal occupancy. She gave my address as though it were an address she had some standing over. Then she hung up and told me that officers were on the way, and she suggested, almost kindly, that my family might want to wait out here on the lawn rather than inside the house. My mother came back out onto the porch with 2 bottles of water and handed me one, and she said, "Lo, come inside, Darius." I told her no, and I want to explain why, because it was the only real decision I made that morning. If we went inside, then when the officers arrived, they would find a closed door and a woman on the sidewalk who had already had 10 uninterrupted minutes to tell them a story. They would knock. We would open the door and be, immediately and structurally, the people being investigated inside the house. Everything after that would be us explaining ourselves through a doorway. If we stayed in the driveway, we were 3 people standing in the open beside a rented truck, in the middle of the most ordinary activity in American life, and the woman who had called would be standing right there while I answered questions. That is a different picture. I have spent my career learning that the first picture people see is worth more than the third argument they hear. So my mother sat on the porch steps in the shade. Camille stood next to me with her arms crossed, furious and silent, which for Camille is an act of tremendous love. I put my driver's license in my shirt pocket and the house keys in my hand where they could be seen, and we waited. 2 cruisers came, not one. They came without sirens, which I noted, and they parked with a gap between them, and there was a moment of that flat quiet that settles on a street when everybody within 4 houses is suddenly watering something. Vanessa moved toward the officers before either of them was fully out of the car. She walked with her hands slightly raised, the way a host greets guests, and she began speaking while she was still crossing the grass. I heard her introduce herself as the president of the association and say the words on behalf of the owners. The officer who took the lead was a solidly built white man about my age, name tag Whitaker, first name Grant, though I would not learn that until later. He was careful in a way I appreciated more in hindsight than in the moment. The first thing he did was hold up a hand and separate us. He asked his partner to stay with Vanessa near the sidewalk, and he asked me to come speak with him near the front of his vehicle, and he asked my mother and my sister to remain where they were on the porch. He did not raise his voice at anybody. He did not put a hand anywhere near his belt. He asked and he waited, and that mattered. I heard most of what Vanessa said anyway because she was not trying to be quiet. Her account had 4 parts, and she delivered them in order, and each one was constructed with real care. She said I was not a resident of Wellington Crest. She said the association had received no notice of any sale or move-in, which she presented as though notice were a legal requirement rather than a courtesy nobody in the neighborhood had extended in a decade. She said a truck was being emptied into the residence in plain daylight, which was true and which she said in the tone people reserve for describing a crime. And she said she was concerned that the actual owner's property was being violated. Officer Whitaker wrote for a while. Then he asked her the question that turned the entire morning. He asked who the actual owner was. She said the family that had lived there previously. He asked for their name. She gave a last name. He asked whether that family still owned the home, and she said she assumed the sale had not closed, and he asked what that assumption was based on, and she said the association had not been notified. He asked whether she had contacted the previous owners that morning. She had not. He asked whether she had checked the county property records. She had not. He asked whether anyone had reported a break-in, or a forced door, or a broken window, or a missing person, or anything at all beyond her own observation of a truck in a driveway. Nobody had. She said, and this is close to verbatim, that she did not need a computer to know who lived in her neighborhood. Then he came to me. I gave him my driver's license. I gave him the house key and told him he was welcome to try it in the front door himself, in front of everybody, which he declined but which I think registered. I told him the closing had been Thursday at a title office on Providence Road, that the deed had been recorded that same afternoon, that I had the recorded copy and the settlement statement in a folder on the kitchen counter, and that my attorney's name was on the file if he wanted to call her, and then I gave him the number that ended it, though I did not know yet that it would. I gave him the parcel number. Most people do not know their parcel number. I knew mine because 6 months of negotiation over an unusually shaped lot will burn a string of digits into your head whether you want it there or not. Parcel 17-B. When I said it, Whitaker stopped writing for half a second and looked up at me, and I understood that a man who reads property paperwork all day had just recognized a man who also reads property paperwork all day. Vanessa called out from the sidewalk that anybody could carry around a stack of papers. Whitaker turned his head and asked her to let him finish, not harshly, but it was the first sentence of that entire morning that Vanessa Crowley did not control, and I watched her register it. Her chin came up slightly. Her hands, which had been busy the whole time, went still. She had spent 20 minutes as the narrator. Now she was a witness being asked to wait her turn, and it visibly did not fit her. Whitaker asked me to stay where I was and went back to his cruiser. He sat sideways in the driver's seat with the door open and worked the terminal mounted to the dash, and the only sound on that street for nearly 4 minutes was the tick of the truck's engine cooling down and a sprinkler 2 houses over. Then he looked up over the top of the door and asked me one question. What day did you buy this house? I told him. Thursday the 11th of June, recorded that same day at 3:20 in the afternoon, and I told him the name of the title company that had handled it. He typed. I stood in my own driveway with my hands loose at my sides and my mother watching from the steps, and I want to be honest about something. I was not afraid of the outcome. I knew what the record said. But there is a particular weight in standing on land you paid for while a stranger with a computer decides out loud whether you are allowed to be there, and I felt every ounce of it. My mother has felt more of it in her life than I have. She sat very straight on those steps. She did not look at Vanessa once. Camille went inside and came back out with the folder. She did not hand it to Vanessa. She walked it directly to the cruiser and held it out to the officer, and she said, "The recorded deed is the first page." Then she stepped back exactly one pace, which I thought was a nice touch. Whitaker read it. He read it slowly, the way you read something you intend to be able to describe later. Then he compared what was on the page to what was on his screen, and I watched his eyes move left, right, 3 times. Grantor, Grantee, Parcel 17-B, Wellington Crest vicinity, Mecklenburg County, warranty deed, recorded, book and page stamped in the corner. Grantee, Darius Holloway. The name on the license in his other hand, Darius Holloway. The address on the license, updated Friday at the tag office because I am the kind of man who updates his license the day after closing, the address of the house behind me. He closed the folder and handed it back to Camille and said, "Thank you, ma'am," and he got out of the car. Vanessa had not been idle during those 4 minutes. She had gathered 2 other people, a man in golf clothes and a woman with a small dog, both of whom lived somewhere on the street and neither of whom looked like they had volunteered for this. She had positioned them beside her. She had, I realized, assembled witnesses. She still believed she was about to watch something. Whitaker walked to the sidewalk. He stood so that all of us could hear him, which I do not think was an accident. "Mrs. Crowley," he said, "you're telling me this man is trespassing." She said yes. She said it firmly. She said that he was not a resident and had no ownership interest in the property and that she wanted him and his family removed. And Officer Grant Whitaker said, "He's the owner of record." Nobody spoke. I have been on job sites when a crane stops. There is a specific quality to that silence, and that is what the sidewalk sounded like. The man in the golf clothes looked at the ground. The woman with the dog picked the dog up for no reason at all. Vanessa's face did not fall, that is worth saying. She did not have the decency of a collapse. Her face reorganized itself quickly and competently, and she went straight to the next position without visiting an apology on her way. She said it was a misunderstanding. She said she was sure the officer could appreciate how it looked. And then, within about 15 seconds of learning she was wrong, she found a way to make it my fault, and she said that if I had notified the association properly, none of this would have been necessary. I asked her the only question I wanted answered. "Why did you call the police before you asked me my name?" She did not answer. She looked at Whitaker instead, as if he might hand her something. He didn't. He asked her for the report, whether she had observed any forced entry. She said no. He asked whether she had spoken to the previous owners at any point that day. She said no. He asked, and he wrote her answer down, whether she had verified ownership through any record before contacting dispatch, and she said, with an edge in it now, that she had not thought it necessary. Then he did the thing I did not expect, and it is the reason his name is in this story at all. He told Vanessa Crowley that she was standing on private property and asked her to step off the driveway. She had come to have my family removed from a house. She left the driveway first. She walked to her SUV with her 2 witnesses trailing behind her like a receipt she couldn't put down, and she stopped at the door and turned around. "You may own the house," she said. "That doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want here." Then she drove off, and Officer Whitaker gave me a card and said if there was any further issue involving that individual, I should call and reference the incident number, and he said the word individual with a care that told me he had already decided what he had witnessed. I thought it was over. That is the part I am almost embarrassed about, because I have never once assumed a difficult stakeholder was finished on a project, and yet I stood in my kitchen that night eating pizza out of the box with my mother and my sister and genuinely believed a woman like that absorbs a public correction and goes home. The first violation notice was taped to my door on Tuesday morning. Improper vehicle storage. A rented box truck parked in a driveway between the hours specified in a section of the community standards that I looked up and found did exist, though it applied to commercial vehicles, and the truck had been returned Sunday morning. Wednesday there were 2 moving containers and cartons visible from the street, and an unapproved exterior color which referred to my garage door, which was the color it had been on the day I bought the house and on every day of the 11 years before that. Thursday there were 3, a planter near the entry walk described as an unapproved landscape structure, guests present on the property without registration, which was Camille, who had come by after work with takeout, and a repeat citation of Tuesday's vehicle notice, escalated, with a fine amount printed on it. By the following Monday I had 9 notices in 11 days. 9. For a house that from the street looked exactly like every other house on the street, except that some of the boxes had not made it to the recycling yet. Any one of them, alone, is the kind of petty nonsense you laugh about at work. All 9 together are something else. All 9 together are a file, and I recognized what was happening because I have watched it happen in construction disputes for 2 decades. When somebody cannot beat you on the merits, they start building a paper record of your noncompliance so that later they can point at the stack and say, look how much trouble this one has been. The stack is the argument. Nobody is meant to read it. So I stopped treating the notices as insults and started treating them as evidence. I photographed the front of my house every single morning at 7:15 with the timestamp on. I photographed the garage door. I photographed the empty curb. I photographed each notice in place on the door before I took it down, so there would be no question about when it had been posted. I built a folder on my laptop and a second one in the cloud. I logged every phone call and the time it came in, and there were calls, 4 of them from a blocked number in 1 week, all of them ending when I said good evening and waited. And I replied to every notice in writing, the same way each time in 3 sentences. I acknowledged receipt. I requested the specific covenant section and recorded instrument that the violation was issued under. I stated that all further communication should be in writing to the address on the deed. That last part is what got to her. I know it did because she told me. We ran into each other at the mailboxes at the end of the 2nd week. She was collecting hers. I was collecting mine. She looked at me for a long moment in the way people do when they have been rehearsing something and are now deciding whether to spend it. She said, "You know, maybe this isn't the sort of community that's a good fit for you." And I said, "Maybe the community isn't the problem." She told me the fines would continue to accrue and that unpaid assessments could become a lien on my property. And she said the word lien with real pleasure, the way you'd hand someone a bill. Then she walked to her car. I went home and scanned everything I had, all 9 notices, all my written responses, the deed, the title report, the settlement statement, the survey, and the incident number Whitaker had given me, and I emailed the whole package to Mallory Keene. Mallory is a real estate attorney in Charlotte, 44 years old, dry as a saltine, and the person I had used for the purchase because a colleague told me she reads title work like other people read a menu. She had already been through my file once. I expected her to call the next day and tell me to pay $200, stop feeding the animal, and go live my life. She called that night at 9. "Darius," she said, "how much do you actually know about your parcel?" I told her what the agent had told me, old estate, carved off, deeper lot, oaks along the back. She said she wanted to walk me through the chain, and then she said the sentence that changed the shape of the whole thing. Vanessa Crowley has a much bigger problem than these fines. Here is what Mallory had found, and I am going to lay it out the way she laid it out for me because the whole ending rests on it. Wellington Crest was developed in stages beginning in the late 1980s. The land it sits on was assembled by a developer from several sellers, and one of those sellers was an elderly woman who had inherited a small working farm from her father. She sold the developer everything that surrounded her homestead. She would not sell the homestead itself. There is correspondence in the county file about it. The developer came back twice more over 4 years, and she said no both times, and eventually the streets were platted around her, and she lived in the middle of a new subdivision on the last 2 acres of her father's farm until she died. That homestead is my lot, parcel 17-B. It is not a lot that was created by the subdivision. It is a remnant that the subdivision was built around, and the house on it was built later, in the 90s, by the family who bought it from her estate. Which brings you to the covenants. A homeowners association's authority is not magic, and it is not implied by proximity. It comes from recorded instruments, declarations of covenants, and restrictions that are attached to specific described land. When a developer expands a subdivision, each new phase gets annexed into the declaration by a recorded supplement identifying the property being brought in. That is the mechanism. Land that has never been made subject to a declaration by a recorded instrument is not governed by it just because it shares a street sign. The title company had flagged this during my closing. It was in my file. I had read the exception page and had not understood what I was reading, which is a thing I will not do again. Parcel 17-B was subject to some obligations. There was a later recorded agreement covering the private street, the storm drainage easement, and a share of common maintenance executed by a prior owner in the mid-2000s, and I owed my assessments and I have always paid them. But it had never been annexed into the amended and restated declaration of 1996. And the amended and restated declaration of 1996 is where the architectural review provisions live. It is where the guest registration language lives. It is where exterior color approval lives. It is where the vehicle storage schedule lives. Which is to say, 7 of the 9 notices Vanessa Crowley had taped to my door-sided authority that did not reach my land. "I want to be precise with you," Mallory said, "because precision is the only thing you're going to need. You are not outside the law. You are not outside your obligations to your neighbors. You have a maintenance obligation and an assessment obligation, and you're current on both. What you are outside of is the specific set of rules she has been using to punish you, and she never checked, same as before. That was the pattern, and once I saw it, I could not unsee it. She had not checked the deed before calling the police. She had not checked the annexation before issuing fines. Vanessa Crowley did not investigate. She recognized, and then she acted, and the recognition was the whole process. And then Mallory said the thing that mattered more than the covenants. There's something worse for her in here. Look at the July 3rd email. I looked. On July 3rd, 22 days after a uniformed officer had stood on a public sidewalk and stated that I was the owner of record, Vanessa Crowley had written to me, copying 2 board members, a sentence describing me as an occupant who is not the lawful owner of the property. In writing, copied to others after verification. That's not a mistake anymore, Mallory said. A mistake is a thing you correct when you learn better. She learned better in June and wrote it anyway in July. Keep that email somewhere you can find it in your sleep. Mallory sent a records request to the association, the ordinary kind, the kind any member is entitled to make, governing documents, all recorded amendments and supplements, minutes of board meetings for the preceding 2 years, the architectural committee's approval records, and the fine assessments issued against my address with the authorizing vote for each one. Vanessa refused, not in a clever way. She wrote back that the request was not appropriate at this time. So Mallory sent it again formally on letterhead with the statutory citation and a deadline addressed to the board, not to the president, and copied to every board member by name. That is the moment the story stopped being between Vanessa and me. Because it turned out that the other board members had not been told very much. They knew there was a difficult new owner on the East End who was refusing to comply. They did not know that the difficulty had begun with a police call. The treasurer, a woman named Elaine Porter, who had lived in Wellington Crest for 19 years and kept the books for a school district before she retired, called Mallory directly, which board treasurers are not really supposed to do, and asked her a very simple question. She asked whether it was true that the association had summoned law enforcement to a member's home without any evidence of a break-in. Mallory told her she was not able to characterize the association's actions, but that the incident number was a matter of record, and that Mrs. Porter was free to request the report herself. Elaine Porter requested the report herself. Meanwhile, Vanessa did what people do when the ground moves. She got louder and more official. She sent a notice of hearing, scheduled for a Thursday evening in the clubhouse, listing 11 alleged violations now, proposing fines totaling $1,950 and referencing the possibility of a lien. I had asked for 3 things before any of that. I want the record to show how small they were. I asked for the unfounded fines to be withdrawn. I asked for a 1-page written acknowledgement of my ownership so the question could never be reopened by a future board. And I asked that the association communicate with my family through official written channels rather than approaching my mother on my porch, which had happened twice. Vanessa refused all 3. She refused them in an email that used the phrase, "I am not going to be lectured." And then she called a public hearing to fine me in front of my neighbors, which is the single most helpful thing she ever did for me. The clubhouse meeting room holds about 40 people. There were more than 60 there that Thursday, standing along the back wall and out into the hallway by the vending machine. Word had traveled, not because I spread it, because I never said a word to a neighbor about any of it, but because the woman with the small dog had been standing on that sidewalk in June and had apparently found the experience unforgettable. I came with Mallory. She wore a plain navy suit and carried 1 accordion file and set it on the table in front of her without opening it, and I have thought since that the closed file did more work in that room than anything she said. Vanessa opened by describing me. She did it well. She said the association had welcomed a new owner in June and had unfortunately encountered a sustained pattern of resistance to community standards. She said she had personally been subjected to hostility. She said that her role required difficult conversations and that she had never in 11 years shied away from them. She was building herself into the person under attack, and for about 90 seconds it was working, and I could feel a few people in the room settling into the comfortable idea that this was a dispute between 2 stubborn parties. Then she put the violation list up on the screen. Mallory did not object to any of it. She let the whole list sit there in the light, and when Vanessa finished and asked whether the owner had anything to say, Mallory stood and asked 1 question at a time, the way you set fence posts. Item 4, exterior color approval. Which section of which recorded instrument is that issued under? Vanessa named the declaration in the article. She was fluent. She knew her document. Thank you, Mallory said. And by what recorded instrument was parcel 17-B made subject to that declaration? Vanessa said that the property was located within Wellington Crest. That's a description of geography, Mallory said. I'm asking for the annexation, a deed of annexation, a supplemental declaration, a recorded consent by the owner of that parcel, book and page. Vanessa said she would have to review the file. I've reviewed the file, Mallory said, and she opened the accordion folder for the first time. She put down the amended and restated declaration of 1996 with its Exhibit A legal description, and she read out the parcels it covered, and 17-B was not among them. She put down the 4 recorded supplements from 9799, 2001, and 2004, and none of them included it either. She put down the original subdivision plat, and she put down my survey, and she put down my title report with the exceptions page tabbed, and she put down the mid-2000s maintenance and easement agreement that I had signed onto obligations under and had paid every quarter without a single late payment. And then she put down the county's chain of title going back to a farm. The association has authority over this parcel for street maintenance, drainage, and its share of common expenses, Mallory said. Mr. Holloway is current. The association does not have architectural review authority over this parcel, and 7 of the 11 items on that screen are issued under an instrument that has never been applied to his land. He has asked for those to be withdrawn 3 times. Elaine Porter asked whether the association's attorney had reviewed the fines before they were issued. Vanessa said the president had authority to issue notices. Elaine asked whether the board had voted on the escalated amounts. Vanessa said the board's practice was to defer to the architectural committee. Elaine asked who chaired the architectural committee. Vanessa said that she did. You could hear that land. 60 people understood at the same moment that the person issuing the citations, the person setting the fines, the person chairing the committee that reviewed the citations, and the person presiding over the hearing on the fines were all one woman in a cream blazer. And then Elaine Porter asked the question she had come to ask. Vanessa, before you called the police to that house in June, did you look up the owner in the county records? There was nowhere to go. She had already answered it once on a sidewalk to a man who wrote it down. No, she said, I did not think it was necessary. I stood up then. It was the only time I spoke at length that night. I said, you didn't call the police because a record told you I didn't own my house. You called before you ever looked at a record. That's the whole thing. Everything after that has been you trying to make the paperwork agree with a decision you'd already made in my driveway. The room was very quiet. Somebody's chair creaked. My sister, 2 seats down, did not say a word, which I know cost her something. Elaine asked to see the incident report. She already had it. She read the relevant portion aloud, and it was worse for Vanessa than anything Mallory or I could have said, because it was flat and it was official and it had no feeling in it at all. The reporting party stated that the individuals present had no right to be within the residence. Verification of county records confirmed the complainant's assertion to be inaccurate. Resident produced a recorded warranty deed and photo identification matching the owner of record. No evidence of forced entry, no signs of unlawful entry, no third party asserting an ownership interest requested police involvement, no further action taken. Vanessa said she had been extremely cautious rather than accusatory. She said that in this climate a person could not be too careful. And Camille finally spoke once and only once. She said, you asked our mother what the homeowner had hired her to do. Vanessa said that was taken out of context. There were 4 people standing there, Camille said. Say the context. Vanessa lost it then, in the contained way that people like her lose it. Her voice went high and tight, and she told the room that a clerical oversight was being turned into a spectacle, that she had given 11 years of unpaid service to this community, and that she would not be made into a villain over a misfiled address. I did not raise my voice. I said the last thing I said that night. A clerical oversight is writing down the wrong house number. You looked directly at me on my own property and decided I couldn't be the man who owned it. Then you spent a month building a file to make that true. The board went into closed session. It took 31 minutes. I know because Camille timed it out of pure spite. When they came back, Vanessa Crowley was not sitting in the president's chair. The vice president read a short statement. The board was suspending Vanessa's officer authority pending a review of the enforcement and appeal process, and of every fine she had approved as chair of a committee she also presided over. All violations against my address were frozen effective immediately. All association records access under her control would be transferred to the treasurer within 48 hours. And the board directed that no officer or committee member would communicate with my household except in writing through counsel. 9 days later, after the association's own attorney went through the file, 7 of the 11 violations were voided outright. 2 were dismissed as unsupported by any vote. 2 remained, both from that first week, both concerning the moving cartons and the rental truck, and both reduced to warnings with no fine, which was correct, and which I accepted in writing the same afternoon without argument. I had never wanted to be a man who owed nothing. I wanted to be a man who owed what he actually owed. There was no arrest. Nobody was dragged out of anything. I want to be honest about the shape of it because the satisfying version and the true version are not the same, and the true version is better. Vanessa Crowley kept her house. She kept her money. She kept her cream slacks and her white SUV. What she lost was the only thing she had actually been protecting the entire time, which was the authority to decide who fit. She had told me in my own driveway that I did not belong here, and 11 weeks later she was a resident like any other resident, sending requests to a board instead of issuing verdicts to a neighborhood. She resigned from the board entirely in the fall rather than sit through the review, which I understood. It is one thing to lose a seat. It is another to sit in the room while people go through your files. Officer Grant Whitaker came by once more in August to close out a detail in the supplemental report. He stood on the walk and looked up at the house, at the porch, at the oaks along the back line for a second longer than the errand required. He said, "Hope the next time we talk it's for a more ordinary reason." I said, "So do I." That was all. I did not need it to be more than that, and I think neither did he. It is October now. My mother has taken over the porch entirely. She sits out there in the mornings with her coffee and a cardigan on the back of her chair. Camille comes by most Sundays and complains about the kitchen, which I still have not updated. The association has a new president, a retired firefighter who has said maybe 40 words to me total, and all of them useful. In September, the board adopted a written procedure requiring documented verification of county ownership records before any officer contacts law enforcement regarding an occupancy or residency question. It is 1 paragraph long. It exists because a woman looked at my family in a driveway and did not read 1 line of public record. I did not sell. People asked me if I would. 2 neighbors told me gently that they would understand, and I believe they meant it kindly. But selling would have handed her the last word on a house I spent 19 years of work to be able to buy, and it would have made this place a bad memory instead of my address. I was not going to do that. My mother has a porch. My sister has a Sunday. The oaks out back were here before the streets were. The deed is in the second drawer of my office desk in a plain folder underneath the survey. I do not take it out. I do not need to look at it, and I have never once shown it to a neighbor. I keep it there because I remember exactly what it felt like to stand in the sun in a wet t-shirt while a woman I had never met looked at my mother, my sister, and me and decided with her eyes that we could not possibly belong to this house. She called the police to prove I had no right to stay. And the thing she summoned to remove me became the first person to stand in front of that whole street and say it out loud, plainly from the record. The name on the deed is Darius Holloway. The house was never hers to decide who could walk into it.